Hi, I am Joy Axelson. In this lecture of Philippians, we're going to be looking at some historical background about this city and when Paul first visited it, and we're going to look at some other important BRI information. So let's look first at when Paul first arrived in Philippi. So this would be your internal evidence of the historical setting and culture of the original reader. And we find this in the book of Acts, chapter 16, verse 9 through 40. So Paul was on his second missionary journey, dating around 49-50 AD, and he went with Silas. And they were on their way. He was in Troas, and then he got a vision of a man from Macedonia asking him to come and help them. So through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, they changed their course and went into Macedonia. Well, we see in Acts chapter 16, verse 12, where it says that Philippi was a leading city in this district of Macedonia, and it was a Roman colony. So God was leading them to Philippi. Paul normally, of course, in most cities, he went to the synagogue, but there was not a synagogue in Philippi. And do you know how many men it just takes to have a synagogue? It only takes 10 Jewish men. So there were not many Jews in this town. So instead, we see in Acts 16, verse 13 through 15, where he goes to outside the city to a river where there were people praying. And there he met a lady named Lydia, who was a businesswoman, and she was a God-fearer who became a believer. The only other story that we have about his visit in Philippi is when he got irritated at this little girl who was demon-possessed. And he commanded the demon to leave. And then the people in the city didn't like this. And this is a quote from Acts 16, verse 20 and 21, where it says, they said that these men are Jews and they're disturbing our city. They advocate customs that are not lawful for us as Romans. So from this quote, you can see that they were very prideful that they were a Roman colony, and they didn't want to do anything different than what their Roman customs were. So what did they do? They put Paul and Silas in prison, and then there was an earthquake, and eventually the jailer and his family become believers. And then the magistrates of the city were so afraid once they learned that Paul and Silas were Roman citizens. So we can see from this story how the people in Philippi were very loyal to Rome. They were sensitive to anything that was different from their Roman customs. And this Roman colony was very unique because it was in the middle of all of these other Greek cities. But it wanted to keep its uniqueness and its loyalty to Rome. Other believers who are mentioned from this church in the book of Philippians is Epaphroditus, and there are others mentioned in Philippians chapter 4, verse 2 through 3. This church might have been in Lydia's house because at the end of Acts 16, verse 40, we see that they meet in her house. So perhaps, even though she was from another city, perhaps she had moved there. We don't know for sure, but maybe they met at her place. But from within the book itself, you can see how Paul had a close relationship with the believers there. They were very generous to Paul several times. We see in Philippians chapter 4, verse 15 through 16, how they helped him financially after he planted the church there, and even when he went on to Thessalonica. Philippi was not a wealthy city. We see from 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1 through 5, how the cities, including this city in Macedonia, gave a gift for the poor in Jerusalem, and how they gave out of their own poverty. These believers sent another gift, financial gift for Paul with Epaphroditus in Philippians chapter 4, verse 18. So they were very generous, and they were a caring church that had a special relationship with Paul. So let's look at some external information about the historical setting and culture of the original reader. Philippi was a very old city and historical city. It was located at a major crossroads between Europe and Asia. It was founded by Philip of Macedon, who was Alexander's father, between 358 and 357 BC, and it was named after him. After a battle between Octavius and Mark Antony against Brutus and Claudius, that city became a Roman colony in 31 BC. After this, it was rebuilt by Emperor Octavian, who made it as a military outpost and populated it with veterans and made it into a Roman colony. So the dignity of Philippi as a Roman colony was very strong, and we saw that again out of what we read of Acts 16 verse 12. So this information from this verse is very important to understand the background of the people. Because Philippi was a Roman colony, it exempted them from paying tribute. These colonists, they had the right to own land, to have their own local administration and law. They had the same privileges as all the people who lived in Rome. So sometimes it was called the Little Rome. Philippi was mainly made up of Romans, but also had Macedonian Greeks and very few Jews. They were very proud of their ties to Rome and of their Roman citizenship. Paul refers to this pride when he talks in Philippians 3:20 and reminds them that they are actually citizens of heaven. Paul also talks about the Roman colony when he talks about the royal guards in chapter 1 verse 13 and Caesar's household in chapter 4 verse 22. So he relates to them because some of the readers would have known these people. Philippi also contained a large retired and exiled Roman soldier population. These Roman soldiers would have added to the patriotism for Rome. They had fought and they had defended Rome. It's very possible that the church contained some ex-military men. Paul uses military terms in the letter. For example, in Philippians chapter 1, verse 27 through 30, where he talks about standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side, not being frightened by your opponents, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and so on. So we see how that can give you an idea of people in the military standing together in unity, fighting together against the same cause. So that's the ideas that we see in this book. Women also played an important role in this church. There were many women worshiping by the river in Philippi. We see that in Acts 16:13. And you see the businesswoman Lydia and also the other women leaders that are mentioned in Philippians chapter 4 verse 2, which had worked side by side with Paul but were causing a bit of trouble in the church now. So, when and from where was Philippians written? Well, some internal evidence, we can see that Paul is in prison. We can see that in verses chapter 1, verse 7, verse 13, verse 17. We also see that he's facing a trial that might end in his death. Philippians chapter 1, verse 19 through 20, and chapter 2, verse 24. We also see that there's royal guards there where he's being held in Philippians chapter 1, verse 13. There's some from Caesar's household, Philippians chapter 4, verse 22. There's extensive evangelism going on around him, Philippians chapter 1, verse 14 through 17. But he does expect to get out of prison and come and visit Philippi. We see that in chapter 2, verse 24. And Timothy is with Paul. We see it in Philippians 1:1 and chapter 2, verse 19 through 23. I've included in this unit that there is a handout that's called When and Where Philippians was written during Paul's imprisonments. There's a possibility of 4 dates and places of imprisonment that it might have been written, and I've also included in the handout the the pros and cons of these different imprisonments. The most traditional place where people think that he was in prison was in Rome, but another good option could be when he was in prison in Caesarea. But you need just to look at the handout and think and decide for yourself. Lastly, I want to look at the occasion for this letter. There was disunity and division in the church, so Paul is writing to them to encourage them to live in unity, and through being humble and through humility as a way to unity, where Jesus was the ultimate example of humility. We see that in Philippians chapter 2, verse 1 through 18, and chapter 4, verse 2 through 3. Paul also deals with some false Jewish teachers or Judaizers in chapter 3. Paul recommends Timothy to the church and gives a report about the health and the plans of Epaphroditus in Philippians 2, verse 19 through 30. And Paul also wrote to thank them for their concern and for their financial gifts in Philippians 4, verse 10 through 20. So hopefully through this lecture you have a better understanding of the historical background of this book and why it was written. Thank you.